Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section we're going to be looking at functions in general, and I want to look first at tools that help you find the functional functions that you need. Now let's take a particular example, and I know that I need a standard deviation function, and that's a statistical function. If you look at the Formulas tab, you'll see the function library group and some of the most commonly used categories of function. So you have financial, logical, text, date and time, so on and so forth. Note also there is a category called recently used, and if you use a fairly restricted set of functions, that's actually quite a good feature because it makes it more likely that the function you want has been used recently, and you can see there the top 3 functions that I've last used. If you look at the other end of the group, there's a More Functions drop down. More Functions gives you access to other categories, and one of them is statistical. The flyout list lists all of the available statistical functions. Now it's worth noting that with each of these, as you hover over them, you'll get a screen tip about that particular function. And underneath that screen tip, there is a link to help. So what you might do, knowing that you need a statistical function, is scroll through the list and try and find the function that you need. Now, if you didn't find it, it might be because you didn't know the name. Now, there is another option, and that is to click on the Insert Function button. The Insert Function dialog here has the category field pre-selected at statistical because I was looking at this before I invoked it. There's another way of invoking the Insert dialog box, and that is where you can invoke it by using the FX button on the formula bar. So once I've invoked the Insert Function dialog box, I have access to the same list of functions, the statistical functions that we were looking at previously. There are a couple of important differences using this dialog. Notice that as I click on each of these functions, I will see an equivalent of the screen tip information underneath. I also have a link through to help on this function. This will open an external window and give me the information that I need about this specific function. Another big advantage of the Insert Function dialog box is that if you don't know the name of the function that you want, you can use the search facility. Now I know I need standard deviation, so I'm going to type into the search box standard deviation and click go. And this brings me up a list of functions that in some way involve standard deviation. The first one is stdev. That's the old standard deviation function, and as you can see there from the text underneath, the list this function is available for is compatible with Excel 2007 and earlier. Then we have the current standard deviation options. This one is for calculating standard deviation on a sample, and we have various other functions for calculating standard deviation. So what I'm going to do here is calculate the standard deviation of numbers in cells A1 to A7. And I'm going to put the result in D4. So let's invoke the Insert Function dialog box. And I'm going to search for standard deviation again. And I know that the one I want to use is this one just here. So now I can see my function arguments dialog, and this is a useful dialog not only because it will remind you of the arguments you need, but it can also help you enter the arguments for the function, so you can not only type arguments in, but you can make selections on a worksheet to form the arguments for the function. The cursor is flashing in the first argument field, and I could type in there the first number from the list, so in this case the number that we have in cell A1. I could also put lists of numbers or ranges, for example. Note the prompt on the right there that tells me a number is expected, but if, as in this case, the numbers are adjacent, I can also select the range of numbers. And now you can see that my first argument is a range. If I wanted to add a second range, I could put that in as number 2, or I could put a comma in between number 1 and put an additional range in there as well. So it's very flexible. Now the functions argument dialog gives me a preview of the formula result, and I can just click on OK. And there is my standard deviation. Now there is another feature that can be very useful, and that's a feature called Formula Autocomplete. Now, in order for this to work, you need to make sure your options are set correctly. The option you need is on the Formulas page in the Working with Formulas section, second option down, Formula Autocomplete. And as the screen tip shows, it shows a list of relevant functions and defined names when building cell formulas. This functionality can be enabled or disabled by using the keyboard shortcut Alt plus down arrow when in formula editing mode. Now the reason for giving you that straightforward shortcut is that this function can be both helpful but a little annoying as well. So let's suppose that I'm going to put a formula into D4 that's going to involve one of the amortization functions. I can type in equals to start the formula, and as soon as I type in A, I get a list of the functions that start A. You can actually move this little screen tip out of the way just by clicking and dragging if you're finding that a little bit annoying. Now let's say I know it's AM, and I decide it's probably the first one. So when I double click, not only do I get the arguments for that function, but the function itself has a link to a help file with more information on that particular function. This will give me a full explanation of the function and usually some examples, so that can be really helpful if you're trying to work out if this is actually the correct function. Depending on the arguments, as you start to type in the values, so let's say the first value I want is cost, and let's assume it's $3,000. Not only does the next argument in the list get highlighted, but if it's possible, what the Formula Autocomplete will do will offer me options or recognize what I'm typing in that particular argument. Now my next argument is date purchased, and in this case, Excel won't be able to recognize which date I'm going to use, but if this was a name I was typing in, it would be able to react to what I was typing to help me identify the name that I want to include. Other than that, I carry on entering my arguments. Remember, optional arguments are in the square brackets, and that's it. That's Formula Autocomplete. Now, in these first two sections, I've introduced you or recapped for you some of the key features for using functions in Excel 2019. In the next section, I'm going to look at the Autosum functions, as they have some rather important and unusual features that's worth knowing about. And in subsequent sections of the course, as we use some of these functions, you'll see some of these features I've been talking about in action. But that's it for this section, so I'll see you in the next one.